それでは小泉様、よろしくお願いいたします。
Please go ahead, Mr. Koizumi. Thank you for the kind introduction. My name is Junichiro Koizumi. Thank you for this invitation. Mr. Mikitani has been very supportive to all of my activities, and Mr. Okutani, who also serves as a director, I have frequent occasions to meet with him. I've been given 30 minutes, and I was given complete freedom to talk about anything I wish to. And they even said I could talk about nuclear power stations, because this is not the Keidanren, the Japan Business Federation. This morning, the U.S. began attack on Syria. That big news came in, and there is tension on the rise on this planet. I'm not going to touch upon that subject, though. And I'm rather going to talk about why we must eliminate all nuclear power generators around this world in the next 30 minutes. When I was serving as the Prime Minister, I used to say nuclear power stations are necessary. But 6 years ago, when we experienced the Great East Japan earthquake, tsunami, and Fukushima nuclear power station meltdown on March 11th, you probably saw all of those video images and newspaper articles that made the headlines every day, and the tragic scenes. People used to say there's absolute safety in nuclear power generation, and in comparison to other energy sources, it is clean energy without CO2 emission with reduced cost. And those were the three assertions that the generators used to suggest. And I began to question whether those were really true. I became skeptical. I had already retired from the political scene, so I had much free time. In 2009, I retired from House of Representatives. It was in 2006 I retired from Prime Minister, and the accident took place in 2011. So I had much time to do lots of reading. So I was reading novels, history novels that I like, but I thought there's something strange here, and I began to read about the nuclear power generation, why Japan decided to introduce nuclear power generation, the history, and the assertions of academic researchers who, even before March 11, began to advocate that we should get rid of nuclear power stations. And I began reading those books. So I compared safe, cheap, and clean, which were the points raised by those who were for the nuclear power generation, and I discovered that they were all fake. I was deceived. I was cheated, but I'm the stupid one that was deceived. So should I keep quiet and not admit that I had been deceived? But it was such an egregious lie that the more I studied, I began to get mad and disappointed, because so many smart people were lying. Appalling. So I completely changed my thinking after I saw that accident develop in front of my eyes. So let me explain to you the reasons why. It's been 50 years since Japan introduced power generation, nuclear power generation. In 1969, the commercial nuclear power stations were introduced, and there have been accidents around the world. In 1979, 3 Mile Island meltdown in the United States, and it's still banned for people. 86, Chernobyl of the Soviet Union, meltdown occurred, and no residents there. People can't live there. Children who used to live there is suffering from leukemia and thyroid cancer. And still, after 30 years, there's much damage. People can't live there. 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl occurred. And people began to wonder whether it's truly safe in Japan, but many experts said that Japan is different from Three Mile and Chernobyl. The Japanese nuclear power stations are safe. That's what they said. So there's a multi-layered security system and safety ensured. Even if there is meltdown, there is several layered safety, even if there is power outage. We received damages from the A-bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, so we are very sensitive to radioactivity, and engineering is at extremely high level, and so we used to say Japan is completely safe. That's what we used to say, that's true, but then when I saw those scenes from Fukushima day in, day out, I thought something was wrong. Even after Chernobyl, experts used to say the Japanese reactors are safe. Back then, there was the Science and Technology Agency, and the Director General of Nuclear Power Bureau used to say that we're safe in Japan. Even if there should be an accident, there would be no leakage whatsoever of radioactive substances, no necessity of evacuation of nearby residents, and it is the Japanese nuclear power stations that are completely safe because of the multi-tiered security system. That's what the experts said. And the mainstream press media companies, journalists in the science departments used to write in their articles that nuclear power stations are safe. And talking about whether there's safety or not is not the essential problem, because it's very important that we think on the presumption that there is absolute safety in nuclear power generation. I won't name the journalists, but that's what they used to write about. And people believed. It was back when the Democratic Party of Japan was in power. But after that, the investigation committee was established through a cabinet decision post-accident, and they spent about 1 year to come up with the conclusion. The chairman of the investigation committee, was it Hatamura? I think that was his name, but he stated his opinion. Accidents, even if the probability is low, it can always happen. He says, even if you think that it cannot happen, it may happen. And then Dr. Kurokawa took over. He became the chairmanship of the Diet Committee, and they came up with the report on the Fukushima meltdown accident. And they said that it was man-caused. In other words, tsunami and earthquake were natural disasters, but their conclusion was that the accident was man-made, that it was purely from negligence, that there was insufficiency of safety measures in place. And before Fukushima accident, there was this debate that the safety measures may not have been enough. But TEPCO said, no, there's multi-tiered security system, there's absolute sufficient safety measures in place. But it wasn't. They said if they introduced more safety measures, they would become economically unviable. And then that accident happened. 3 reactors melted down, and the 4th one. What would have happened if the 4th one melts down? What would be the worst case? The 4th reactor, if meltdown was caused and leakage of radioactive substance occurred, then within 250 kilometers diameter from Fukushima, people would have had to evacuate. Fortunately, the 4th reactor didn't go through the process of meltdown, but if the 4th reactor also had molten down, 50 million people, as many as 50 million would have had to be evacuated. So Tokyo would have been within 250 kilometers diameter. So this is 50 million out of 150 million total population. Where would they go to take refuge? There's no place. So that had been the situation we had been placed. And safety measures were insufficient. Why? Did TEPCO reject, saying that it's too costly? Now we know that it was pure negligence, but when they built the nuclear power station, they ignored what they should have complied with. What was the requirement to nuclear companies? In whatever the situation, safety must constantly, at any given moment, be given the highest of highest priorities. And they belittled that. They didn't place highest priority on safety, rather economic profitability. Profitability first. TEPCO still wouldn't admit it, but that's how they were. 6 years after, they don't even know what goes inside after that meltdown. They created robots. The fuel rod. If humans would die in 1 minute, they don't even know where the nuclear fuel rod is after the meltdown. 6 years have passed. And with state-of-the-art advanced technology, robotics, they introduced the robots. But once the robot went in, they became dysfunctioned. And groundwater. So there had to be a system where groundwater would not be ejected into the seas. So they thought about the state-of-the-art system on the coastal side. They froze the soil to build a frozen soil wall. And that should have been completed last year. But yet there's this part of the wall that doesn't freeze, even after 6 years. It's some parts are unfrozen. So where does that groundwater leak from? Think about it. And the 3 Mile Island meltdown, they never removed the fuel rod, and it's the first time Japan is trying to do that. But where are we going to put the removed fuel rod after we remove it out of the premise? What if it drops? The contaminated water, there are thousands of tanks already. Decontaminated garbage is in specially treated bags, but there's huge amount. And they asked the landlords for storage space for a tentative period, but it's all full. And until last year, 3,000, 4,000 daily workers with protective suits, even during the peak of summer and cold water protective wear. You go in once, and that's the only one time you can use that protective uniform for protection, because there's so much dose. So you have to make 3,000, 4,000 sets of those protective wear. And there aren't municipalities who would accept those protective garments because they don't want to use their incinerators to burn them. So no one wants to accept the fuel or the garbage from Fukushima. So they're thinking about building an incinerator within the Fukushima premise. So of course, the protective suit manufacturer is making money because they need thousands of it every day. So, and also the contaminated water. 1,000 tanks full of contaminated water. What are they going to do about it?
If should there be an earthquake or a tsunami, what are we to do? There are no disposal sites. 54 nuclear power plants were in operation before, and there's no disposal site. And people kept on hoping that one day there'll be disposal sites. But to this day, there's no disposal sites in the world. Intermediate disposal site, a robust facility should be made. Even if we reduce nuclear power generation to zero, maybe in 100 or 200 years, there'll be technology to reduce waste, or within the disposal sites to reduce the concentration of radiation. That technology might emerge. But we do have to create intermediate disposal sites. Even if we are to go zero nuclear power generation, we should have intermediate sites. There's one place that has the final disposal site in Finland. It's called Ankara. I went to visit 3 years ago. And in Finland, they are built on rock. And so if you go through the rock, there are tunnels. And if you go to the Helsinki airport and you board a jet, and if you go to the seaside by car, and you take ships for about 15 minutes, and then you come to an island. It's a rock island. From top to bottom, it's a rock. And they've drilled down 400 meters. They've drilled it down 400 meters. And there's a 2 kilometer square disposal site. It's pretty much complete. You go on a microbus and you spiral down. And there's a 2 square kilometer site where there's a site where there is a cylinder, perhaps using iron and copper, so that radiation will not leak. And in this cylinder, 400 meters underground, they bury the waste, and they keep it for 100,000 years, so that there'll be no damage done to human bodies and plants and animals. It takes 100,000 years. It's not 100 years or 200 years. It's year 2000 now. And there's only one disposal site in Ankara in Finland. In the Finnish language, it means a hiding place or a cave. So when you hear Ankara, it's almost like a pronoun for the final disposal site. I said, it's already complete, but the guy told me, look at the walls. It's still wet. Partially, it was still moist. And he said, it's still moist there. This moisture, in 50,000 years or 100,000 years, we have to watch whether it doesn't turn back into water, and they have to inspect that. It's made of rock, and it's 400 meters underground, and there's a little moisture there. And if it becomes water and it floods the site, that is what they're concerned about. And I don't think this sort of thing would be possible in Japan. 400 meters underground. We have contaminated water. We don't know where it comes from. We don't even have to go 400 meters underground. We don't know where the groundwater comes from. If we dig 400 meters, maybe we'll have hot springs. And then I came out of the site, and at the entrance, I was told that there's another problem there. And the guide was laughing as he said it. And he said, don't laugh. Listen, you go outside. In Finland, there are 4 nuclear power plants. In Ankara, their capacity is only for 2 power plants, nuclear power plants. Waste from 2 nuclear power plants. That is their capacity at Ankara. But foreign countries' waste, they have decided that they will not accept the foreign waste, and they don't know what to do about the remaining 2 nuclear power generators. 400 meters underground, 2 square kilometers has capacity only for 2 nuclear power plants. Now, if they close this, and think about another one, 50,000 or 100,000 years, they won't be able to open this site. You shouldn't even look at it, and you shouldn't bury it. You shouldn't dig into it. And they're wondering in what language they should write this words of caution in. You think that this might be a joke, but it's real. Do not dig, do not look. That should be a sign. But if people write that, people are very curious, so people are bound to want to see. 10,000 years or 100,000 years, will there people who are able to read this sign? We can't read the Manyoshu classical Japanese language anymore, so that was only 1,000 years ago. The Hyakunishu card games, there are only about half of the population that are able to understand this card game. The pyramids, 2,000 years, 3,000 years ago, even specialists, archaeologists cannot read the language there. So we're talking about 50,000 years, 100,000 years, and the waste has to be stored there for that long. Language changes. So in what language would they put up the sign? I haven't asked them. English only will not do. Finnish language only will not do. They use all of the languages of the United Nations? Maybe in 100,000 years, people will not be able to read it. Well, 30 years ago, we would say kireru in Japanese, and that meant that the person was very clever. But if we say kireru now, it means that the person has lost his temper, or he's crazy. So that's the extent to which language changes. Before I went to Ankara, I saw the disaster 6 years ago, and I felt this cannot be done in Japan. After having seen this, a Mainichi newspaper reporter came to me and asked me for impressions. And so I said he wouldn't make an article out of it, but he does have a column, and he did write a column, and it was Mr. Yamada of a Mainichi newspaper, and he said, Koizumi says 0 nuclear power. I'd been giving talks before, but the amazing power of newspapers. People are talking about how I used to promote nuclear power when I was a prime minister, and that I would not stray from my theory, but I did. So why is it 0 power generation after 7 years? People, and he said that you cannot reduce nuclear power generation to 0 on cold days, and on summer days you need air conditioning, and the nuclear power generation used to account for 30%. So wind power, solar, and geothermal will not be able to replace nuclear power generation because they only account for most 2%. 30% was the contribution of nuclear power generation to the total power, and this person was saying that's impossible. But what happened? In 2011, in March, the accident occurred. And from 2013 September to 2013 September, it was only 2 nuclear power generations that were in operation. From 2013 September, for 2 years, there was 0 nuclear power generation. From 2015 September to present, we now have 3 power regenerations because 1 was allowed to operate. So the 3 units are such that those advocates who used to say that was under 2% of natural energy, solar power provides enough power for 10 nuclear power units from Hokkaido to Kyushu. Not a day goes by. Not a day have we had a day where there was a power outage. We have a surplus of power. Of course, there are typhoons and the power lines go down. But in the past 6 years, there has been not a day where there was a shortage of power. Even with 2% provided by nuclear power, because of other sources of energy, there has not been a day where there was a shortage of power. That has been proved that we could go for 6 years without nuclear power. And Germany said that they would go down to 0 after they saw the Fukushima disaster. But several power plants are in operation, though. Germany has it nice. They can buy from France. And when former Prime Minister Schröder came to Japan, he said, people often point that out, but Germany declared 0 nuclear power, and they buy from France, but then they re-export the nuclear power that they buy from France. So the natural energy, other than nuclear power, provides 30% of nuclear power, and they have enough power to export. So he told me not to tell lies about Germany. France and Germany and Spain, they have introduced a lot of non-fossil natural energy, and Denmark is talking about going 100% natural energy. Presently in Japan, we are doing fine without nuclear power, 0 nuclear power. 100 years, we can go for 100 years. 30% was the amount accounted for by nuclear power. But alternative sources of energy, government used to pay for nuclear power. If they switch to providing this money to non-fossil natural power sources, in 10 to 20 years, 30% can be provided by natural energy. Last year, a nuclear power company talked about a new standard, new stringent and tough standard. And they said that they took safety measures in line with these standards. And they filed an application to the Nuclear Regulatory Authority for putting nuclear power plants into operation. And last year, the Nuclear Regulation Authority chairman said that the new standard has been met. But according to the chairman, this is what he said. He said that I'm not saying that it is safe. If the Nuclear Regulatory Authority gives the go-ahead, you think it's safe. The government said that it was safe, and they said that the Nuclear Regulatory Authority said yes, so the nuclear power plant can be put into operation. This is the safest standard, safest and the toughest standard in the world, the government said. Please compare with the United States. In the United States, when they build new power plants, the local governments, or you have to submit a plan for evacuation in case of disasters. Nuclear power plants have the military protecting it. In Japan, we don't do that. And we have no evacuation measures. 6 years from then, it's not radiation. Even lightly decontaminated wastes cannot be disposed. There's not one disposal site in Japan. Those operators that engage in dismantling buildings, or those operators that deal in industrial waste, appliances and so forth, the industrial waste companies, I felt, should be created. The industrial waste disposal site should be found. And unless these disposal sites are identified and made, permission and licenses will not be granted to the industrial waste operators, because there'll be environmental destruction if waste is thrown into the ocean and in other places. So the industrial waste operators must build sites to operate. But nuclear power plants have no sites. Why does the government permit nuclear power generation in spite of that? Nuclear waste cannot be compared to industrial wastes. If there has been an accident, people can die in several minutes. There's no place to dispose of nuclear wastes. Why don't people understand this simple logic? They said that the cost was cheap. How could they say that? It says that it'll take 40 years to decommission. To decommission, it takes 40 years. In the UK, they are most advanced when it comes to decommissioning. But in the UK, they say it takes 90 years, 100 years to decommission.
They underestimate everything in Japan, cost as well as the number of years it takes to decommission, but they overestimate safety. Meltdown. Even after 6 years, even with robotics, we don't know what's going on. How do we remove each fuel rod and place them where? We don't know. I don't think the issue would be settled even after 40 years. And what are the nuclear power generators doing? They build and there is unlimited liability. In other words, they have to pay the damage and the decontamination and decommissioning. All those costs must be borne by the company. And what do they say? They complain that it's too costly. Our company can't afford to do everything ourselves. But power is important, right? So government, please help us, they say. They don't have enough money to cover decommissioning and decontamination. And then the government says, yes, power is important. If power supply is suspended, then companies cannot run factories, so no choice. Government, upon request by TEPCO, provides 5 trillion yen, and that's the ceiling on any assistance to be provided by the national government, and they paid. After 2-3 years, TEPCO says 5 trillion wasn't enough. Can you give us 9 trillion yen? So government says yes, up to 9 trillion yen. And then they said last year, 9 trillion, not enough. Can you pay us more? So they underestimate the cost. At the beginning, Monju is a typical example. That was 30 years ago. The nuclear reactor waste in ordinary nuclear reactor is taken to Monju, and if recycled, they thought that it could be reused for nuclear power station. Monju is the god in Buddhism that is renowned for intelligence, so they named it Monju. 1985, the construction began with government budget, and 95, the construction completed, and then there was this fire only after 2 to 3 months since launch of operation, now suspended. So 30 years since construction began. Finally, last year, they concluded no more Monju. The organization that runs Monju has to be reorganized. They neglected their commitment to safety and checking safety measures, so this fire was caused. So the dream reactor came into a disillusion reactor, and 1.1 trillion yen of taxpayers' money was injected into Monju. Chernobyl, 3 Mile, Chernobyl, Fukushima were the 3 major accidents, but there have been some small incidents in between. And if we count those smaller incidents, the accidents caused at nuclear power stations are numerous. Koizumi-san, there's no technologies that's immune from accidents, they say. But what about the risk when an accident occurs? And weigh the merit, the benefit that that technology offers, or you cannot take advantage of science. But that's true. But look at Fukushima, look at 3 Mile, look at Chernobyl. People lose their hometowns once such accidents occur. And it is irreversible. And you cannot gain back your hometown in 2-3 decades. Those who were in their 20s, who worked in their hometowns, must leave their hometowns for 20-30 years. Then they would never choose to go back. Those in the 40s had to evacuate in 20-30 years. They would probably have died without ever having going back to their hometown. Suzuki-san is a kamaboko manufacturer in Hiroshima, fish meal, and he opened this place in Odawara. Why is this fish meal so good in Odawara? It's because of the pure water that comes from the mountains of Hakone. There's no place else than Odawara to create fish meal as so tasty. If they lose that, then he would find no other place to create his kamaboko. So he began this movement never to attract nuclear reactors to the Odawara region. Because if an accident occurs, you would not be able to come back for 20 to 30 years. So nuclear business is a business where you are prohibited from causing accident. We have volcanoes, we have earthquakes, we have tsunamis. We have all kinds of natural disasters, and safety measures are going to become even more costly. Until that Fukushima accident, the power companies had monopoly, so they charged the customers, the final users, a margin over the actual cost of running these nuclear power reactors. So they used to say that nuclear power is the least costly, so why are you asking aid from the government? No insurers are willing to offer insurance coverage to nuclear reactors because if there is an accident, it will become non-performing loans, so they would not be able to collect. But now we've proven that we can live without nuclear power stations, and the cost of renewables is much cheaper and safer. We've proven that. And even the municipalities, the local governments, they came up with this tax incentive to give approval to nuclear power generators. And they would tax the taxpayers to provide funds to the power generators. 40 years, 50 years, decommissioning, they can't afford to do it, so they have to rely on taxpayers' blood money. So nuclear power is a business that can't survive without taxpayers' money. And that's not only the burden of the current generation. It's going to be a burden for the next generation who aren't even born yet, those who will be born 1,000 years after today. They would have to struggle with nuclear waste, and they would have to bear the cost too. So that's the nature of this industry. So Japan should never ever be involved in nuclear power generation. If we had a cent to spend in nuclear power generation, this is the most costly industry, by the way. CO2, no CO2 emission, they burn uranium to provide energy. There's no CO2 emission in the premise, but just to make the power generation, they use steel, they use the construction work, and that emits CO2. They're just saying they don't emit CO2 just for the uranium enrichment burning. And then what about the interim storage facility? They would have to keep the spent fuel for centuries. And who's going to pay for that? The taxpayers. So I wonder how they could have survived today. And see, all the power stations are on coastal areas. So there's heat emitted to produce power, and they have to cool down that heat. That's why they are on coastal areas. So they use huge amount of seawater to cool down the heat. Then the seawater is heated, and heated water is emitted from a different outlet. So from one inlet, they take in seawaters with plankton and microorganism, which is lost from our precious ocean. And those microorganisms, if there's 1 degree temperature change, the ecosystem completely will change. So in addition to nuclear waste, it's environment destruction industry, it's a sea destruction industry. Even from the eyes of the layman, even after reading a few books, people can understand that. Why didn't the top management of the energy companies and the officials at the energy ministry, they are the smartest of the smartest in this nation, and why didn't these really smart people who got best grades in the best universities didn't get that point? Skiing slope in Nasu Tochigi Prefecture, and he was a mountaineer who led that student group, and there was this landslide warning, and he thought that there was the wording, but it's completely safe, and he took the high school students, and that landslide caused death among the high school students. And the chairman of the investigation committee of Fukushima said there is no such thing as absolute safety. So Japan has proven in the past 6 years that we can survive without a nuclear reactor. So if we spend a fraction of the cost we invested in nuclear in renewables, then with shorter than 1 century, we can have a nation relying 100% on renewable energy. I'm confident about that, and I've used up all my 30 minutes. Sorry for that.
Usually I speak for 90 minutes. Lastly, I'm no longer a politician, but among the politicians, I believe there's one person whose record will not be broken. That's Yuuki Ozaki. He was referred to as the god in 1951. He died. He was the god of the construction of a constitution. And the Ozaki Memorial was made. And it's called the Constitution Memorial now. And in the gate, there's a stone, a memorial stone, and his name is engraved there. And what is written there is that the stage of life is always in the future. He was 94. That was the age he passed away. Yuuki Ozaki, in 1890, he became a politician in the first imperial election, parliament election. And even with the change of the political system from multiple constituency to single-seat constituencies, he won 25 elections, and he died at 94 in 1961. He said that the place for my work is in the future. I don't know whether it's good penmanship, but it has a depth. It has a flavor. The real stage of my life is always in the future. And he left these words the year he died. When you're after 90, you think, oh, it doesn't matter what happens afterwards. But even at age 94, he had his eyes set on the future. He says that be prepared to be given a place to work or given a place to use your skills. So I've changed my thinking. So in preparation for the future, I should always try to make efforts and learn to be prepared when people need you. That is how I interpret his words. IT is something that I do not understand, but you are all taking on that challenge. I don't know what the world brings in the future. It's a great period of change. How do you cope with this change? It's always with a spirit of reform and challenge. Mr. Mikitani is that way. You're all trying to learn. No matter what your age, you should not forget to make effort. The Japanese were always that way, even after we were defeated after World War II, or when the oil prices skyrocketed. In difficult times, you see opportunities. And we achieved economic growth by turning the United States, which was our largest enemy, and bringing them on our side. A nuclear power plant disaster, we hope, will be a difficult event which we leveraged to make ourselves better. We have to make ourselves into a country that can use renewable and natural sources of energy. And I think we are a good country and we're able to do that. I'm sorry I've overrun my time. I'd like to wish you good health and success from the bottom of my heart. Thank you very much.